The rabbis teach it's a great zchut, it's meritorious to cite your teachers by name, b'shem omro. So I want to give a shout out and my thanks to Rabbi David Shuck of Bethel Synagogue Center in New Rochelle. One of the great aspects of my Hartman Fellowship is that the learning we receive not just from our faculty, but it's also from our peers. And it was David from whom I learned a number of the sources that I bring to you this evening. Not only that, but he inspired me to speak about something which is hard and personal. How many of you have read at least parts of Job? It's a story of suffering, irrational, capricious suffering, through dozens of brutal chapters. Through dozens of brutal chapters, a man loses everything dear to him and endures the ignorant, sometimes infuriating kind of God-splaining of his so-called friends. Raymond Shinlin writes in his commentary on Job, the book of Job sets the terms for the discussion of suffering in such a way as to render meaningless the consolations of conventional piety, traditional wisdom, and theology. In their place, it offers a poem. In other words, Job exists to name the fact of suffering, the inexplicability of suffering, and in its refusal to clearly explicate that suffering, invites us to simply sit in its presence. The Rambam, Moses Maimonides, says of the suffering we endure, much of it is a result of our own actions. We punish ourselves, to be sure. But he also says that there's plenty of suffering left over that cannot be simply explained away. What's especially telling about the book of Job is that after all is settled, after Job has proven himself capable of taking whatever the universe has to dish out, God calls his friends to account. The Lord says to Eliphaz HaTemani, I am incensed at you and your two friends, for you have not spoken the truth about me, as did my servant Job. Now take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and sacrifice a burnt offerings for yourself, and let Job, my servant, pray for you. Job's friends outdo themselves, trying to come up with simplistic explanation for Job's pain. And when all is said and done, God's response is to tell them to make a sacrifice, to apologize. In Job, suffering happens. It is inscrutable. It is unrelated to his behavior. The sinning is to be found paradoxically not in the actions of the sufferer, but in the words of the consolers. Alan Marinis, the author of Musar Pathways, writes, most of us walk around engaged in unconscious, involuntary, unwarranted, and hypercritical judgment of other people. The habit is so common and so subliminal that drawing attention to it can be an enormous wake-up call. We all lead double lives. There are the things that we talk about publicly, the face we put on, the stories we tell to live in the world. But all of us have secrets. Some of them are mistakes we've made that we know could compromise the lives we wish to lead, the status we enjoy, the relationships we hope to have, or the jobs that we seek to hold. But there are other secrets we keep not because we've done wrong, but because we're just ashamed. Or perhaps we're not ashamed, but we think that we'll be judged or scorned or excluded by people and from communities we value. I'm not here to judge anyone's silence tonight. Assuming we are not harming others or ourselves, we all get to choose with whom we share our secrets. But I am also here to say that too many of us remaining silent creates a culture of silence, an expectation of silence, which quickly and too easily, my friends, becomes a culture of shame. So this evening, I want to share a couple of my secrets with you. My great hope is that in doing so, I'm not being self-indulgent, but merely honest. In all candor, this is not easy for me. Even after 8 years of being your rabbi, I am reticent to reveal what I am about to, but the rabbinate is also a calling, and in this moment, I feel called to speak my truth. Some of you know that I have a master's degree in Jewish education. My first year of the program, I was taking an educational psychology course, and we had a unit on neurological disorders. I found myself looking at the textbook and its list of common symptoms of Tourette Syndrome. I didn't know much about TS, except how I'd seen it mocked on television in shows where the character is shouting obscenities or something like that. And when I was in summer camp, there was this kid who would go outside the cabin and grunt very loudly, sometimes for minutes on end, until he was able to get himself under control. So there I was in my ed psych class, running my finger down the page, and all of a sudden thinking not about my Hebrew school students, but about my own childhood. Those with Tourette syndrome express motor tics. Check. And vocal tics. Check. Frequently, these are expressed in tendencies comorbid with other conditions like obsessive-compulsive disorder. Check. I sat there, the list in front of me. Check, 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 check. And suddenly, so much of my earlier life came into focus. My need to touch things, tap things. How as a child I would check my stuffed animals at night to make sure that they were breathing before I went to sleep. The noises I made in class that I expended so much mental energy to contain. The dirty looks other kids would give me. When in a quiet classroom, I made it difficult for them to focus on their tests. Eye crossing, sniffing, touching things in odd numbers, always 3 or 5 times, not 4 or 6. The girlfriends who would get annoyed when I absent-mindedly stroked their hand over and over in a certain pattern. I started wearing contact lenses because I was a 3-sport athlete, but also because glasses made me nod my head and squint in weird, noticeable ways. Made me is a good way to describe it because for a kid with TS, it feels like you're absolutely out of control. My parents noticed the tics, but the pediatrician called them nervous habits. Everyone thought I would simply outgrow them. Now, please understand, I don't blame them, my parents or my doctor. My mom's here today. My parents loved me, they did their very best, and there was little known in those days about Tourette syndrome. Honestly, researchers don't know that much more about it today. It may be related to an excess of dopamine in the brain. What people don't understand about these kinds of disorders is that, especially for someone like me who has a relatively mild version, it's less about the embarrassment of people seeing and noticing me tick, though it is also about that. Rather, it's the amount of focus required not to tick. Ever enter a staring contest? You know what I'm talking about, where you look at somebody across the table and stare into their eyes and try not to blink. Picture doing that on every dinner date. Trying to maintain eye contact without winking or crossing your eyes or tapping your plate. Picture trying to get through a timed exam when you fixate on lines, reading the same sentence over and over again. Imagine how it feels to know that you're a passable math student, but a pretty good writer and a voracious reader who gets higher math than verbal scores because you can't finish the exam. I don't mean to complain. I'm fine. Really, I'm fine. better than fine. I have a great life. I went to a good college, I have a job that I love, and a family who loves me. On Yom Kippur, we offer the vidui. We offer a confessional prayer. I don't confess today because I believe it was a sin to keep this from you. And I'm certainly not looking for pity. I do so because I hope it will be instructive. And I hope that some of you who also suffer in secret might realize you don't have to, that people in your lives, in your shul, in your families might be better able to handle your honesty than you think. I am here taking a leap of faith in you. It's not easy to confess, but hineni, here I am. You might be wondering, do I still have TS? Yes. For many people, including me, the symptoms lessen as you get older, but they're still there. They're always there. And certain stressors make them more present. High holy days are not a good time. In the traditional Avodah service on Yom Kippur Day, the priest does 3 confessions, but today I have only 2. The second one, though, is a bit harder, believe it or not, because if Tourette Syndrome is stigmatized, depression is even more so. To be clear, I am not depressed, but I was. It lasted about 18 months. I was in therapy. I was medicated. It was scary. My kids didn't know what to make of it. It was hard on my marriage. And each day I would show up for work and perform weddings and brises. I would counsel congregants. I would give sermons to you. I would sing cheerily with my guitar. And it's not that I was faking it. At least that's not how I experienced it. It was more like being fully present in those moments with you, left me mostly or utterly bereft in those moments without you. 1 in 100 people have Tourette syndrome. Depression rates in the US are 20 times higher. Millions of people live with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Among the 20 million adults in the US who experienced a substance use disorder, half had co-occurring mental illness. And anxiety is even more common than depression, the #1 mental health disorder these days, affecting a remarkable 1/3 of both adolescents and adults. And we're only beginning to understand its ramifications. What does our tradition have to say about depression? The Mishnah was written down in 200 CE, 1700 years before Sigmund Freud, 1800 years before DSM-5, but our sages were certainly aware that there are people whose urges or limitations powerfully influence their behaviors. You know that Shabbat observance is of great importance to Judaism, and you probably know that extinguishing a flame on Shabbat is a no-no, except in the case of pikuach nefesh, saving a life. But the Mishnah says the following: one who extinguishes a lamp because he fears idolaters or bandits, or because of melancholia, or so that a sick person may fall asleep, he is exempt, but not to spare the lamp, to spare the oil, or to spare the wick. Violating the Sabbath to save your lamp's wick is forbidden. Extinguishing a flame because you simply have to be in the dark, that's forgivable. In Hebrew, the phrase for melancholia or depression, as it were, is ruach ra'ah, an evil spirit. Ovadia mi Bartanura, the 15th century Italian rabbi, quotes the Rambam. Ruach hara'ah is a type of illness that is black bitterness, he says, in which the afflicted can only rest when they sit in the dark, secluded from other people. And the psalmist was not afraid to express what these days we could only call a state of deep depression. O Lord, will you ignore me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long will my enemy have the upper hand? Look at me, answer me, Hashem, my God, restore the luster to my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. My TS is chronic and ongoing. The depression I experienced was acute and seems to be resolved. But there are people in this room, people in our lives who are suffering in the dark. They climb into bed for days at a time. They eat too much or too little or nearly nothing at all. They feel utterly or constantly debilitated. They are in a pit, and their vantage is mostly or always looking up from below. Remember the scene of Joseph and his brothers, how they strip him of his ketonet pasim, his beautiful cloak, and they throw him in a pit? The text tells us the pit was without water, which could mean that they weren't trying to drown him, or it could mean that they left him in a desert climate without even water to drink. And then they decide to sell their brother into slavery. But what I never noticed before is what happens between those two things. While Joseph is in the dry pit, before the Ishmaelites arrive, Veyeshvu le'echol lachem, the brothers sit down for a meal. What is depression like? It's like sitting in a pit and looking up at the world around you, your friends, your family, your coworkers, and they're going on with their lives. They're going to bars, and they're enjoying meals, and they're laughing, and you're alone peering up at them from the dark. Many of us have secrets about conditions and afflictions that are not our fault, but for which we pay a high price. There is a culture of silence, stigma, and shame in which people with disguisable maladies feel compelled to disguise their maladies, not empowered, but compelled. We think that the worst sin we can commit against our neighbors, our brothers and sisters, is to rob them of their freedom, to sell them into slavery. And those are terrible crimes, to be sure. But how often do stories of egregious offenses mask subtler failings? The way so many of us, while doing a completely normal thing, like sitting down for a meal, fail to notice those who are struggling to get out of the pit. Or worse, who are extinguishing a flame on Shabbat to do the only thing that seems plausible: sit in the dark. What I learned from my friend Rabbi David Shuck, what I've learned over the years of pastoral counseling to people who struggle with mental illness, is that there are not easy solutions or an easy way out. Sometimes there's no way out. You just have to climb down into the hole and sit with someone for a while. But what I do know is that the most important thing is to acknowledge the person and the pit. And one final thing. Most people who have impairments or disorders, who have been touched with mental illness or other challenges, while we feel frustrated about our disorders, we also come to understand that they are a fundamental part of who we are. And liking who we are depends on our being able to reconcile the brokenness with our fundamental goodness and worthiness. I read John Eich's biography of Muhammad Ali this year. One observation that stuck with me: Ali was almost certainly dyslexic. It was a condition that was misunderstood and untreated in his day, but there is some evidence that the eyes of people with dyslexia, because of their struggle on the written page, adapt to provide a person with other abilities. It's quite possible that Ali's uncanny spatial intelligence, his ability to pinpoint exactly how close he could stand to an opponent to avoid a shot and still land a counterpunch, was related to his dyslexia. I have Tourette Syndrome and some compulsive tendencies and a history of depression. And in my heart of hearts, I know that whatever suffering I have endured in my life, these things have helped to shape me, and in some ways I can't understand, make me a better father and husband and son and rabbi. Whatever secrets you are keeping, not the ones for which you need to atone on Yom Kippur, but the ones that are not your fault. This Yom Kippur, you might ask yourself, am I keeping them a secret because I want to, or because I feel I have to? Good Yantif.